About the topic of the presentation, what we are going to be talking about is about sustainability practices in youth-led organizations. Well, when I say youth-led organizations, I don't mean to represent all of the youth-led organizations, but rather basically my experience on the topic. Now, what my experience is on the topic, this is something that we are going to see right now. Yes. So who am I? I'm Álvaro González Pérez. You can read right there. I'm an activist in the youth field, so I've been involved in the youth sector, volunteer-based youth sector for now 6 years. And I'm also a youth working and trainer, so I also have another hat in a more professional capacity, working also as consultant and trainer. And then this photo there is my two realities converging together, delivering a training on activism, on the topic of activism and advocacy. But basically the hats that I am wearing today are as former vice president of EIGE, European Students Forum between 2019 and 2020, and as co-founder and board member of Generation Climate Europe between 2019 and 2021. Which I just finished doing now. What those organizations are, this is something I will cover now in a moment. So essentially what we are going to cover is how I've been working and how has been my experience on integrating sustainability within the reality of these two organizations, within EIGE and Generation Climate Europe. And after that, we will also have a moment to talk about different challenges and opportunities that I have experienced, so that also you could maybe relate to within your realities or your experiences in the field. Now, about EIGE. What is EIGE? EIGE is a non-governmental, politically independent student organization that is working towards a democratic, diverse, and borderless Europe, and is essentially present all around the continent in 40 different countries. So basically its scope is not just the European Union, it also goes beyond that. The 25% of its membership is actually out of the European Union. And basically the 5 main, let's say, means that define what EIGE does, or basically that helps their means, let's say, towards achieving its vision and mission, are personal development and non-formal education, policy and advocacy, intercultural exchange, forum for discussion, and thematic projects. Now, this is a bit in very general terms what EIGE does, but I'm not here to talk to you just about, let's say, EIGE and its identity as a whole, but rather as what it does in the topic of sustainability. Maybe one thing important to point out right now is that EIGE as a youth organization doesn't work just on it works on the topic of sustainability and climate change, but it's not the, let's say, the main definitory topic of the organization. And this is something relevant because there's been quite a shift in the organization. So EIGE has been operating since 1985, so for quite a few years. And just for you to understand how the reality and the priorities of the membership have shifted over the years, in its strategic plan from 2017 and 2020, the main focus areas, as we call them there, that are essentially the main topics that we would that the organization works on, not on an let's say organizational or operational level, but rather as, for instance, in terms of advocacy, were these 4, which were equal rights, civic education, youth development, and European citizenship. And before that, I basically didn't engage much on the topic of climate change or sustainability. It had some interest groups that were tackling the topic, but it was never, let's say, a major topic. But this changed in the new strategic planning, that is the current one of the organization, to quite an extent. So these 4 topics that you can see are the current ones, that also some of them can relate to each other. So equal rights is more or less represented in social equity. A branch of what was being done in youth development is covering mental health. And then political activism is also something that is quite transversal of all what the organization is doing in terms of advocacy. But the interesting thing is that climate emergency, well, not only is a new topic and is part of these strategic priorities, but also that in the process of selecting this topic, it was by far the most voted one in an organization that is not, let's say, just working on climate and environmental topics. And this has actually shifted a lot the way that the IGA operates on the topic of climate and environmental issues. So this has been reflected in many different topics. So, for instance, the partnerships that also in my year particularly that we were working on in many cases were focused on sustainability. So, for instance, we have a partnership with Ecosia, which, if you don't know, it's how do you call this? It's like a search engine like Google, but with every search that you do, one tree is essentially planted. For accommodation, so essentially when we organize events or learning mobilities as well, we also have a partnership with Hosteling International, which is one of the biggest hosteling networks in the world, and actually they try to integrate also sustainability, social and environmental sustainability practices in basically within their accommodations. And aside to this, it's also quite a common practice right now that several of our local sections are working, or when they are organizing an event, they, for instance, for 3 days, if they have extra food, they collaborate with local NGOs that are combating food waste or that use it for whichever reason, and they take this extra food waste. Which this, by the way, this is also something that is quite a common practice right now in some university campuses and some student unions that they collaborate with Too Good To Go. If you know about it, which is an app which basically you can essentially gather food that is going to be thrown away, and you just take it because I mean it's food that is going to be expired the same day, so you just take it and make sure that they don't throw it because legally they are not. They cannot sell it. So this is something, for instance, that some university campuses, student unions, and a couple of locals also have done in collaboration with both the universities and the app. But then something that we were also covering I briefly mentioned it in the previous presentation, is that the internal structures also have changed a little bit. So on the one hand, we have this climate emergency working group that basically is working on the topic of climate emergency and environmental sustainability, but more from an advocacy perspective. So this is basically the permanent body representing this focus area. But what is quite interesting is that there's another body that is called the Sustainability Committee, and the purpose of this body is essentially to integrate sustainability practices from an operational perspective. So, for instance, if there's an IG local that is organizing an international event, they can always reach out to the Sustainability Committee and ask them for advice on, I don't know, how to reduce their footprint, how to make sure that they integrate, certain practices that are in line with environment, or how can they offset their emissions after the event. So anything that you can imagine is covered by them. And in fact, one thing that they also did is not like it's in the previous presentation. We were talking about different guidelines that organizations have in terms of having checklists on sustainability. So they, for instance, created one of them as well. So it's quite an extensive work that they do. And these things essentially, because these are, let's say, quite intentional actions, no? Like creating a partnership with initiating partnerships with sustainable organizations, changing the structures. These things have quite an impact also on our working culture. So we were covering before the topic of having vegetarian or full vegan or vegetarian events. This is something that has also changed over time in the reality of the organization. So, for instance, if you try to organize a vegetarian event or a full vegetarian event or vegan event 5 years ago in the organization, that would have been quite unthinkable, in the sense of it would be quite expected that there would be a lot of people complaining about it. And now this is something that is actually shifting. So for instance, we have a couple of statutory events that were fully vegan. And in fact, the interesting thing is that no one also complained about it, because before we were also covering how this can change from one country to another. The reality of including, let's say, full vegetarian meals. So for instance, if you're organizing an event in some parts of the Balkans, it might be a bit more difficult to find venues that can serve fully vegetarian events. But it's the same thing with let's say participants or members, in our case, coming from those countries, that sometimes it's like, in some cases, even in the organization, even within IGE, they would be fully, if you tell them explicitly this event will be vegetarian, there will be a lot of voices of concern. Now, in this case, this was not publicly publicized, let's say, as a fully vegan event, and people didn't realize until the second day. So in a way, this is also something about changing the culture, getting used to this new reality, and it's something that is actually steadily changing within the organization. And aside to this, one thing also that is being done quite a lot and promoted by this committee is calculation of CO2 emissions of events, which is also quite interesting, because in the sustainability checklist from the Youth Partnership, there's quite a lot of topics that are covered there, and there are actually some tools. Calculating your CO2 emissions on your own is something that is actually quite draining, and it's extremely difficult, because there are so many different elements, so many different variables that you need to take into account. But there are actually tools to do this. So, this is something that I will also share at the end in resources, but we are using a tool called myclimate, myclimate.org. And essentially, this allows you also to calculate the offset of not the offset of emissions, sorry, the CO2 emissions of your events. And quite, expectably, in most cases, when you are organizing an international learning mobility, in which is actually quite expected, let's say, that participants will travel by flight for whichever reason. This is normally the biggest, let's say, emitter, the biggest polluter, or the biggest cost of CO2 emissions, which is also why we focus quite a lot on the topic of sustainable mobility. And this links to the external work that IJ is doing right now. So, and something that I'm going to cover a bit also in the next slide, which is that in our topic in our work of advocacy, we have covered several different topics within the topic of climate emergency. But one of the most, let's say, emerging ones is the sustainable mobility, which is reflected in our policy paper on sustainable and affordable travel options for young Europeans. But I will talk about this a bit more later. And one of the major things that we did, and this is going to be part, I'm going to cover this right now, is the co-founding of Generation Climate Europe. Now, I'm going to now talk about the challenges that we have faced at the time of integrating learning mobilities, and specifically because learning mobilities can also include, for instance, organizing let's say, when you are organizing the event, making sure that it abides to certain sustainability standards within the event. But since we work quite a lot on the topic of clean and sustainable mobility, as in traveling, this is also what I'm going to focus on. And some of the main challenges that we found, are listed here. Just for clarification, these are listed as well in the policy paper on clean mobility that I will also share with you at the end. And these are essentially the following ones. The very first one that I would mention is actually the one that we have at the end, which is the emissions of the flight sector. So within the reality of 5G, so this is a topic that we have covered quite a bit. let's say, how do we ensure that our mobility is actually sustainable? And obviously, the first topic that comes out, and unsurprisingly, is the fact that when you take a flight, your CO2 emission is extremely, is extremely high in comparison to actually taking a bus, a coach, or a train, which doesn't mean that they do not emit, but the difference is very big. Now, when you try to promote sustainable mobility in the sense of alternatives to flights in an organization where one, it's expanding from the Canary Islands. So if we talk about continental Europe from, let's say, Malaga to Moscow, that's actually quite hard. First of all, in terms of logistics, and secondly, one big problem there was mentioned also before, which is the affordability of let's say of train options. So within the reality of the organization, there are cases, there are some, let's say, local sections that they even have workshops or trainings on how to travel cheaply, in the sense of like how they can take the cheapest route, how they can ensure that let's say they do not have to even pay, let's say, for checked-in luggage, because in the end, also the constituency that we represent socioeconomically varies a lot from in terms of like some of them, let's say, of the membership actually comes from, let's say, a socioeconomically higher background, but some others actually not really, and they cannot afford perhaps to pay 200 euros for their travel. So this is something that impacts also quite a lot, and something very interesting that I also added in here is that this is also, I would say, the reality that other Europeans, not only young Europeans, face. And in the Flash Eurobarometer for 463, this is from 2018, actually not so long ago, 8 out of 10 Europeans stated that they never use train for international trips, which is actually quite a significant amount of people if you think about it. So that's one of the main, let's say, topics there. And then there are some that are external. I also included them here, but they are not necessarily in the scope of what youth organizations can right now influence. I mean, in advocacy, of course, but it's not something that can be impacted directly right now, which would be, for instance, the lack of competition in the railway sector, also nationally, or basically the funding for let's say international connections, or let's say international essentially train connections. So right now we have like a huge patchwork of national railway networks that within the countries they operate quite efficiently, but because there's this lack of cooperation between the different states, it actually it's not very easy also to use it when you have to travel, for instance, through 3-4 different countries. Which, for instance, I come from Spain. Within Spain, Spain is like quite extensive. Then you have France, which is also quite a significantly big country for European standards, and Portugal. But if you are in Central Europe, where there are thousands of borders, in order to also plan this, it's actually quite a different challenge. And another quite big problem that we found also in this policy paper when creating this policy paper is the different price and ticket schemes. So there's this significant difference in mid-long trips between road and flight transfer options. That's something that we also covered before. Or also there's not, if you are also taking international trips, they're asking for let's say, not reimbursement. If your train got cancelled, then you need to ask back for the money. Like if you are doing this through an international trip, like in which you are taking various different trains, this changes quite a lot, which also affects a lot youth specifically, because in general, young people also are facing more financial difficulties than other, let's say, age groups. And then one thing that has been talked about quite a lot lately, also at the EU level, is this lack of night trains, which was quite a reality, a more present reality in the 90s, and it slowly started to fade away. And now it's also a new topic, but because of the amount of time that it takes at the time of traveling to, I don't know, for instance, take a 12 hours train instead of a 2 hours flight. The fact that you cannot take a night train is also something that hinders a lot, at least the membership of IJ at the time of choosing that option. And if it's a reality, the price as well. Very briefly, what is Generation Climate Europe? So Generation Climate Europe is currently the only and largest coalition of youth-led organizations that are operating at EU level on climate and environmental topics. And it's basically guided by the following principles, which is being youth-led, democratic, evidence-based, diverse, intersectional, and human rights-based. I'm not going to stop very long here. Now, its mission is to unite European youth networks and create a platform for young people to advocate for a just and green transition. And it envisions a system that respects human rights on the planet, includes the voice of youth, and acknowledges a common differentiated responsibility in achieving a carbon neutral and sustainable world. Now, this is all that I'm reading right now. And essentially, this is how it operates, or how it was created. A bit about this story. 2 years ago, essentially also when I was at the board of IJ, a few youth organizations came together to create, not necessarily at the time a coalition, but basically to come together to push on the topic of climate and environmental topics. Now, the history of it, the story of it is also quite linked to the fact that at that time, youth-led activism on climate and environmental topics was getting quite emerging. Now, the main challenge that there was at the time, well, I would say everywhere, but also what we identified in the EU is the fact that there was a lot of mobilizations on the topic of let's say youth climate activism, but there was no structured organization that was bridging the voices of youth and the EU. And that's exactly the reason why Generation Climate Europe was born. So it was basically to make sure that there was a platform that covers and represents youth organizations and young people, both on the topic of climate change, climate and environmental topics. And today it has grown to actually represent 9 organizations. Now, one of the most interesting things about GCE is the fact that it's formed by both climate-specific and non-climate specific organizations. So IJ, I've already presented, as you know, is not a climate-specific organization. So now it's working in climate emergency, on climate change-related topics quite prominently, but also on mental health or political activism. And then you have other organizations that are also not working just on climate change. So we have, I can imagine that you are familiar with them, Young European Federalists, ESU, ESN, ETUC Youth, OBESU, or ThinkUp, which are also quite different. So some of them focus quite a lot on education or higher education, like ESU and ESN. OBESU is representing school student unions. ThinkUp is representing also Catholic youth in Spain, right? And in Europe, and then you have also YE and International Young Nature Friends, which I saw that also contributed to the sustainability checklist, and both of them are actually umbrella organizations in Europe, but that are only working on climate and environmental issues. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is that this is 2 quite different profiles of organizations that still converge together in order to achieve this mission that I mentioned before. And the reality that I was talking about before from IJ, the fact that we are not climate specific and still we are trying to integrate so many different structures or activities related to climate and environmental issues, is not just specific to IJ. This is actually happening in a few of these organizations that I just mentioned, and that you can see on the screen. Now, very briefly, well, about the structure. Essentially, there are three main structures that are, let's say, leading the work of GC. On the one hand is the board, where I was representing IG until very recently, and it basically sets the strategic and political direction of the organization. Then we have a small secretariat that oversees the daily operations of the organization. And last but not least, we have the working groups, of which, well, the communication team is essentially part of it, but no need to get into that. Is essentially gathering also volunteers from the organizations, and they are helping to, let's say, on a more, for instance, on research at the time of organizing events. There's also we have this pool of volunteers that work together. And we have 5 main work areas that I'm not going to, let's say, cover necessarily very much in detail. So we also have some time for questions, and have also a few follow-up questions. But those are sustainable development, in which we cover also the link between the climate action and other SDGs. We work a lot on also biodiversity. So, for instance, there's the upcoming EU restoration law that is supposed to be proposed very soon. We work on climate justice. So, for instance, we did a climate justice report, transnational European report on the views and opinions of young people in Europe on the topic of climate justice, on circular economy. And quite a bit, we have also worked on the topic of clean mobility, which I will also stop a little bit in a moment. And essentially, the way that the GC operates is on 3 main topics. On the one hand, this is network engagement. So we are bringing together these organizations that are either climate specific or not, but all of them are working and are concerned on the topic of climate emergency or environmental sustainability. And we gather them under the same umbrella, but we also, let's say, foster collaborations that can go beyond the coalition. So, for instance, like at the time of applying for project funding, like this also serves as a let's say, as a networking space for organizations that operate on that, and ensuring that these opportunities also arise. Then a lot of its work is basically on advocacy, and this was essentially the raison d'être of the organization, which is basically represent, let's say, the voices of these youth organizations towards the institution on the topic. And last but not least, there's the capacity building aspect that we have. Sadly, Generation Climate Europe was and actually quite much related to the topic in hand today about learning mobilities. GC was founded in October 2019, and by the time that we were starting to plan the first learning mobilities, physical learning mobilities, COVID-19 hit. So that was not something that we could that we could implement. But we have actually worked quite a lot on it in a digital level. And one of the main, let's say, projects that we work on is the Youth Climate Dialogues. So this is a series of events that we are organizing in cooperation with, in the framework of the always towards the EU, on connecting young people and, let's say, different institutions, different, let's say, policy actors in the EU. So one of them is the European Parliament Youth Dialogue that we are now organizing the second one, and in which we are also inviting representatives from the different political groups of the European Parliament. Or another one is also the Council Presidency Youth Dialogues that we organize at the beginning and end of each council presidency. Normally with the minister of the country, like working on, let's say, on climate or environmental topics. In the case of Slovenia, we did not manage to get the Slovenian minister, but we have the, let's say, the state secretary on environment. And we also organize a few youth climate and sustainability roundtables on topics related also to the European Green Deal. So always in connection to the EU. So yeah, also to fully clarify, we don't operate towards. I mean, we haven't done much advocacy towards the Council of Europe or towards the UN. This is something that is done also more by the member organizations of GCE. And something quite interesting to add, and this is the one of the last slides that I have, is that before I was talking about how very different organizations came together to found GCE and to work on the topic of climate and environmental topics. Now, climate and environmental topics is very big. It covers many different fields of action. So before we were saying also like the different areas that GCE works on. So we were talking about biodiversity, sustainable development, the circular economy. There's a lot of them. And one of the, let's say, not necessarily a challenge, but you could call it a challenge that the GCE had is the fact that we have all these organizations, all of them work on the topic of climate and environmental topics. Now, what is the one topic that connects all of them? Because IGF, for instance, is not climate specific, but works on circular economy. Now, other organizations there that are not climate specific have not worked on circular economy. Same applies for biodiversity. IGF hasn't worked on biodiversity. Youth and Environment Europe has worked a lot, significantly, on the topic. And we wanted to come together to organize a big project, let's say, pooling the resources and the network that was created through GCE on one common topic. And in the end, very interestingly, the topic that came up was sustainable mobility, because the one thing that all these organizations have in common is that one of the means towards them achieving their vision, whichever it is actually organizing mobility. So most, if not all, youth organizations rely on mobility at the time of I don't know, organizing events or projects or trainings and so on and so forth. So we decided to come up with this project, which is still not a reality, but it's I found it interesting to share also in the context of the EPLM. And essentially, it has three main cores. So the first one is the research and learning and training activities. And one of the main reasons why this is part this will be part of the project is the fact that even though this is a topic that all of the organizations are concerned with, the realities on how to implement it varies a lot from one organization to another, and not only, let's say, within youth organizations, also within young people. So one of the deliverables would be to organize this survey on sustainable and inclusive mobility practices, and the expectation, let's say, from young people and the different, let's say, sections of these organizations in order to implement it. And essentially, another strong part of it would be also creating this capacity building activities and events on different aspects covering sustainable mobility, also based on basically on the framework of sustainable development. So on the economy, on the economical aspect, social aspect, and environmental aspect. And last but not least, the whole idea is also to basically finalize this project with a campaign towards the EU on recommendations that would come up during the project on how to foster further sustainable mobility practices in Europe. Now, this is about the project. For GCE, I don't want to enter too much more in detail with it, but if you are interested in it, you can sign up for the newsletter, or actually we have a podcast as well, or where basically we have also like a youth climate news, which is not an internal newsletter of GC, but it's essentially on topics related to climate and environmental topics, issues in relation to youth. But I also saw they had it in the resources from the, I think it was in the sustainability checklist presentation or in the previous one. But you can also check it through here, and I can share it with you. I see that we have 10 minutes, so I will very briefly go through this, which is essentially the main challenges that I would say in my experience within IG and GC on the topic of sustainability we have faced, and then you feel free to disagree or to add anything on the topic. But let's say in terms of challenges, one of the main ones that that I've seen is that the realities of youth in Europe highly differ. So let's say in order to integrate, for instance, let's say specifically on the topic of mobility, let's say these sustainability practices, if you are also coming, let's say, from a low socioeconomic background, you might not be able to, I don't know, especially in youth-led organizations, when in some cases there are no project-funded, let's say, trainings or capacity-building events. The fact that you might need to pay extra in order to go by train, or that you also need to cover visa costs, this is something that can hinder you at the time of choosing this sustainable alternative. I guess we all agree that online and blended mobilities do not really provide exactly the same educational experience, although I also mentioned this in the opportunities, they are much more accessible, and they also provide a very sustainable alternative in the sense that you don't need to provide food and accommodation and for the event, and people, I don't know, 30, 40 different people are not traveling for that purpose. And then what I mentioned about youth is the same about the realities of youth organizations. So I mentioned before also how even within GC, the realities of the membership are very different. And it was mentioned before also about how the understanding of acceptance or the understanding of what sustainability is varies from organization to organization. So some of them might have certain topics within their checklist, and some others might not consider that either are realistic or, let's say, measure to implement, or that they just perhaps are not aware about it. And in terms of opportunities, well, I mentioned the one on regarding online and blended learning mobilities. One of them, that youth, I mentioned that youth is one of the most affected constituencies in the long run by climate crisis. Well, I mean, it's not something positive, obviously, but it is an opportunity in the sense of that young people are actually, is quite visible that are having, that they have quite a lot of stakes on the topic, because this is one of there are a lot of youth organizations, a lot of movements coming up on the topic. And last but not least, also the availability of evidence-based sources of information has increased a lot over the years. So not basically the information per se, which was always there, but essentially also the availability and how young people from all walks of life can access it.